There were Supreme Court arguments this week on two cases that, honestly, depending on how this goes, it could be the story of the year, story of the decade. This could be the week the internet changed forever because of how the Supreme Court might decide in these two cases. One is Gonzalez v. Google, which is, Adi, correct me if I'm wrong, that's the one that is the boundary of 230, where Google might be liable for the YouTube recommendation system in a very narrow way. Mm-hmm. And the other one is Twitter v. Temne, where Twitter allowing terrorists to use Twitter might make it liable under the Anti-Terrorism Act.
Right. Aiding and abetting terrorism.
Right. And then the facts of this case, Adi, are particularly weird. So go through the Gonzalez case really quickly just so people understand what happened here and why Google found itself in front of the Supreme Court.
So both these cases are about there were Islamic State attacks and someone died in that attack, and the families sued a whole sort of host of services. There's Meta, YouTube, Twitter, saying that they aided and abetted terrorism. And with Gonzalez, the claim is YouTube is not necessarily responsible for just the fact that terrorists were on the platform, but their recommendations served up terrorist videos and ended up then promoting their claim is promoting this and actually creating content instead of just hosting third-party content, which they maybe wouldn't be liable for under Section 230.
If you post something in our comments that somebody doesn't like, 230 just flat out bars you from suing us in many cases. Adi, in this case, what the distinction here is that YouTube's recommendation system took a video for terrorist recruitment and showed it to someone else, and that undid the 230 protection.
Right. The claim is that they are producing their own content. I am hesitant to make any metaphors because metaphors are where everything goes to die here. But it's sort of like if YouTube had published a separate series of videos and was like, hey, these things are all really great and we endorse them, is a little bit where they're going with this.
That's the first case. That's the Google case with 230 in the middle of it.
Yes.
What's going on in the Twitter case?
The Twitter case is one that was basically taken up as a sort of, if you take up Gonzalez, please, please, please take this too, which is arguing that even if 230 falls here, even if 230 weren't around, Twitter is just providing a basic service and terrorists happen to have used that service, and you cannot say that somebody aided and abetted terrorism if there's somebody there that happens to be on your platform and you weren't trying to get them there, you were opposed to them being there, but you failed to kick them off.
So Twitter's saying, okay, look, we know the Islamic State uses Twitter.
Mm-hmm. And like you said, Nilay, the facts of both cases are super weird because there's nobody alleged that there was a specific video or that one of the attackers even used the service. That's not alleged in.
So is it super broad then?
Yeah, it's basically you contributed to the existence of ISIS as an enterprise and therefore you're responsible for.
So I just want to put out the stakes here.
Right.
So if Google loses the Google case in the worst possible way, and the Supreme Court says, all right, your recommendation system on a platform is a decision you have made that creates new content that you are responsible for. Mm-hmm. That means platforms will become liable for what their algorithms do. Algorithms become illegal on the internet, right? And at some level, everything that happens on a computer is an exercise in sorting and prioritization. Mm-hmm. And you get the sense that these cases are out of the Supreme Court because there's ISIS. And so everyone can agree ISIS is bad.
Yeah. Maybe this is clear to everyone, but on a technical level, it's also that there are basically sanctions against ISIS. This is the rare example where there is a group where it is literally illegal to deal with them.
Basically, every platform has to stop operating because there's just no way to open up a user account sign up form and guarantee that ISIS won't use it. Right? You can't.
Are you an ISIS? Check yes or no.
Right? You have to do some work, and most platforms it's illegal to deal with them. So they do some work to make sure that platforms aren't being used in this way.
Yeah.
Surprisingly, TC mentioned this, how surprisingly intelligent the Supreme Court seemed about the stakes in what
Okay.
they were ruling on. So what you would want,
Mhm.
just in an abstract way, you're a lawyer in front of the Supreme Court, you're arguing your position,
Mhm.
you're kind of dancing into, I want the narrowest interpretation of this thing
Mhm.
because that is the most likely outcome,
Yeah.
right? Like every Supreme Court opinion is like literally inclusively like this is a narrow, like they pat themselves in the back. They're like, we threaded the needle, we did it. Once again, the Supreme Court has saved the day in America, right? Here, the dude blew it, right, Adi? They were like, here's a narrow interpretation of this. And he's like, I don't know, maybe Google search should be legal.
Yes. People just like justices just kept asking him things, and they were just clearly like trying to get him to draw any level of lines that would not just blow up the internet. Like, okay, well, what if, thumbnails? What if instead of thumbnails you posted screenshots? And he's like, yeah, I mean, maybe. There's a Google search question that I think this was Kagan again, who was talking about, okay, well, there's search. You're clearly, if you have a top result, maybe you're saying this is really good. And he just would not draw any of those lines.
When I say that I stare into the night sky wondering why the Supreme Court took this case, it's this stuff, or there's not even a direct connection.
Like there's not a specific video.
It wasn't this terrorist saw this video and went and did this act of terrorism.
Because that would
It
be
is
clear.
Generally, people have used this platform. Some of them were terrorists, and some of them maybe are the ones who did the terrorism. There's like not a direct connection there.
And this is all this stuff we've been talking about is what Tamnay hinges on a lot, which is, do you have to have an actual connection to a specific act of terrorism, or is it enough that you are providing a megaphone that lets ISIS recruit?
Okay.
So this is all at least somewhat unsettled.
But it opens the door to, okay, we have now said YouTube's recommendation system gets rid of 230 because it is YouTube making some sort of direct editorial choice that exposes them to liability.
Mhm.
And the thing they have chosen to do is promote the illegal speech of ISIS.
Yeah.
If you can get there, there's no reason you can't replace the illegal speech of ISIS with this illegal defamatory speech about my company,
Yeah.
right? And then maybe you'll win and maybe you won't. But that door right now is slammed shut.
And this just cracks it open.
It just cracks it open to say the recommendations are create liability for YouTube for the content of the speech.
Justice Barrett also raised the question of Section 230 also protects users. So if you hit thumbs up on a YouTube video, is that you then trying to promote and repeat the speech too?
It seemed like, at least in the Google case, there was an understanding of not only the stakes, but what questions they should ask and what the answers at least should be, which I found surprising.
I was surprised and relieved.
Okay. What stood out to you?
I think that they just went through and asked a bunch of the questions we have been asking at just the broadest level. That Clarence Thomas opens up with, okay, so is there an actual YouTube algorithm that promotes terrorism, or is there just a single large recommendation algorithm that happens to give you what you want, and maybe some of that is terrorism? His example used rice pilaf. But I think that there are all these questions that are actually digging into, first of all, how the services work, and not just taking it for granted that there is something called the algorithm that is evil. They recognize computers have to sort information somehow, and so you're trying to make these very fine-grained distinctions. Second of all, there's a real understanding that there are a bunch of services that do rely on these things, and these services have become enmeshed in our lives, and any decision is going to affect them greatly. Brett Kavanaugh made a really big deal out of, okay, what are the economic implications of this? Is this going to tear down a huge section of the internet while we're trying to figure out what the law is? The third part is just that there were these weird little moments where they actually recognize things that I think just many average people wouldn't, which is things like AI text generation and images, that they were talking about algorithms and can algorithms produce content. Justice Gorsuch says, okay, yeah, well, there are these tools that can make images and text. So clearly the algorithms can generate things, and that opens up this whole other can of worms. It was smart, none of which means they'll rule in a way that I like. But it was just a far cry from a bunch of the really bizarre, sweeping, clearly politically motivated rulings and opinions that we have gotten from a lot of courts. including the Supreme Court sometimes.
All right. So we talked about the argument in the Gonzalez case, which is how does a recommendation algorithm work? Are you liable for these thumbnails? What was the argument in the Twitter case like?
Much more metaphor heavy, which is one of my least favorite types of Supreme Court hearing. There's just a huge amount of it turns on, okay, so there is this test that defines what aiding and abetting is for specifically civil cases, like the kinds of lawsuits that are getting brought here. And part of it hinges on, all right, well, what does it mean for Twitter to have known? Does Twitter have to have known that there was this really specific act that was being planned and that ISIS was planning it and that there were these specific ISIS accounts that they had to ban to stop recruiting? Or did it just have to vaguely know that there were terrorists on the platform? And then there's also, all right, how much of a specific relationship do they have with these terrorists? Is this like going into a bank? Is it like selling them a gun? What other, is it like stealing sheep? There are just a million different metaphors in play.
Stealing sheep?
Yes,
What?
this was one of the metaphors.
Who's the farmer on the court, on the bench?
The opening metaphor in the case was, is this more like if you have a friend who's a murderer and a thief and you give them a gun, but you just happen to not know exactly when they'll use the gun? Or is it you doing something like opening a gate and then it turns out that the person you're opening the gate for is trying to steal sheep?
Okay.
So that's like the level of argumentation we're talking about.
Which is exactly like being on Twitter.
Wait, actually, someone trying to steal your sheep and all you have is a gun is fairly close to the average Twitter day, right? It's like, I don't know, I've got to protect this situation. Like, everyone's panicking. There's a sheep thief. I'm just firing indiscriminately.
Stealing your neighbor's eggs would have been the better metaphor.
Tuesday on, there's 30 to 40 feral pigs.
This is an example of how hard things are going to get if 230 isn't around, that you have all these really super fine lines about what counts as aiding and abetting, what counts as something that's really valuable to Twitter or really valuable to terrorists. What does it mean to actually know what's happening on your platform? That right now, Section 230 means you don't really have to deal with these things. If it goes away, suddenly you're making these long, long lists of metaphors and long lists of determinations about what is and is not supporting terrorism.
What do you think happens now? Are they going to horse trade between the two cases like you were suggesting?
I really don't want to make predictions, but yes, it seems possible they're just going to rule in the narrowest, least 230 precedent-making possible way. And I don't know that they necessarily seem that likely to say that Twitter is in the clear. Actually, the most unsatisfying result that I have heard described is that they just say, hey, you changed your argument way too much, Gonzalez lawyers. We're throwing this out for now.
Yeah. So we'll see. I mean, I do think that, particularly with the Gonzalez case, I think the Supreme Court rule that Google is illegal does not seem like a likely outcome. I think with the Twitter case, we think you should do a better job of making sure the terrorists don't, like, that's a safe ruling.
Yeah.
Even though it might have some consequences about like verification or whatever. So we'll see. But we're expecting decisions at the end of this term, which is like quite some time away, right, Adi?
Yeah, I believe the next term starts in October. So yeah, we probably months.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I would say that the general valence from the lawyers in the world is, whoa, that could have got a lot worse.
Well, that's good, right? Yeah.
We'll see.
Yeah, the thing I've heard is clearly they could rule really bad ways down the line, and there are specific subtle ways that we have not talked about here that they could do that, even as part of Gonzalez. But we came out of this much more reassured than we thought we would be.
For sure.